At the first movement of this absolute final phase, the individual fully accepts that permanence is not created by presence but by the absence of dependency, and that the highest form of intelligence is demonstrated when systems no longer require protection, correction, or reinforcement from their originator. The internal shift is profound and irreversible. The need to matter dissolves, replaced by the need for coherence to endure. Action slows not from hesitation, but from precision, because every intervention now risks destabilizing something that has already reached equilibrium. The individual understands that over-functioning is a hidden form of fragility, and therefore deliberately reduces visibility, authority, and symbolic influence to test whether the architecture can breathe on its own. Wealth becomes almost metaphysical, no longer optimized for accumulation or defense, but for continuity across unknown futures. Capital is positioned as insulation against entropy, buffering institutions, cultures, and ecosystems from shocks that cannot be predicted but must be absorbed. Decision-making frameworks are frozen only at the level of principle, while execution remains fluid, allowing adaptation without moral drift. The individual observes without interference, watching how incentives interact with pressure, how values behave when convenience tempts compromise, how leadership responds when no one is watching. Identity fully exits the loop, freeing cognition from distortion, fear, and attachment. The past is not glorified, the future is not controlled, and the present is not dramatized. All three are held with equal detachment. What once required effort now persists through encoded momentum, embedded memory, and shared understanding. Relationships are no longer maintained through proximity or transaction, but through alignment strong enough to survive silence. The individual recognizes that the final enemy of all enduring systems is not collapse but slow dilution, and therefore guards against excess flexibility as carefully as against rigidity. This stage is not quiet because nothing is happening, but because everything that needed to happen already has, and the truest proof of mastery is the calm realization that removal no longer creates instability, fear, or loss of direction, but confirms that what was built from nothing has finally become independent of its creator. At the second movement of this terminal continuum, the individual's role contracts further into invisibility, not as withdrawal, but as confirmation that authority has been successfully transferred from person to principle. The most important work now lies in preserving alignment without articulation, ensuring that meaning survives without explanation, and that standards hold without enforcement. The individual understands that once systems reach this stage, language itself becomes a liability, because excessive clarification invites reinterpretation, negotiation, and erosion. Therefore, communication becomes sparse, deliberate, and largely symbolic, reinforcing precedent rather than issuing guidance. Wealth continues to function as silent infrastructure, cushioning volatility, funding resilience, and absorbing shocks in ways that appear natural rather than intentional. Capital allocation is guided by invariance rather than forecasts, favoring robustness over optimization and durability over speed. The individual no longer attempts to predict outcomes, recognizing that prediction scales poorly across long horizons. Instead, they design conditions that remain viable under many futures. Influence is now almost entirely historical, exercised through accumulated consistency that shapes expectations and constrains deviation without confrontation. Psychological discipline reaches a depth where ambiguity is no longer something to be managed, but a permanent feature of reality to be respected. The individual resists the temptation to intervene, even when intervention would be personally satisfying. The understanding that unnecessary action at this level often introduces fragility rather than strength. Relationships persist through shared custodianship of values, where trust is implicit and correction is rare because misalignment was filtered out long ago. Mentorship becomes atmospheric, absorbed through observation rather than instruction, allowing judgment to form organically rather than through imitation. The individual increasingly measures system health by what remains unspoken and unforced, by how often restraint proves more effective than direction. What once required constant calibration now maintains its own balance, confirming that the transfer from architect to absence is nearing completion, and that the structure born from nothing has achieved the rare condition of self, sustaining coherence across time. At the third movement of this final dissolution, the individual confronts and resolves the last remaining illusion of relevance, recognizing that even silent guardianship can become a form of attachment if it assumes eventual necessity. The internal work at this stage is not strategic but existential, releasing the belief that continuity requires witness, and accepting that true endurance is indifferent to observation. The individual deliberately allows distance to increase, not to test strength but to eliminate the psychological reflex to return. Systems are now left to encounter friction, ambiguity, and minor disorder without correction, because adaptation must be endogenous rather than guided. Wealth flows entirely through institutional memory and encoded rules, functioning less as capital and more as climate, shaping conditions without revealing source. Decisions made decades earlier now operate autonomously, their logic expressed through patterns rather than policies. Influence exists only as a trace, a bias toward certain standards that persists even among those who never met the originator. Psychological equilibrium becomes absolute, marked by peace with irreversibility and the absence of contingency planning for personal return. The individual no longer imagines future interventions, rescue scenarios, or moments of recognition, because all such imaginings imply dependency. Relationships survive purely as shared commitment to coherence, strong enough to endure total silence without anxiety or drift. Mentorship has dissolved entirely into cultural inheritance, where judgment propagates through norms, selection, and example rather than transmission. The individual measures success through long spans of nothing happening, interpreting stability not as stagnation but as proof of structural health. What once demanded vigilance now operates through inertia deliberately designed to resist decay. This stage completes the separation of self from system, demonstrating that the truest form of creation is one that no longer reflects its creator, and that what began from absolute zero has now crossed into a state where continuity exists without memory, authority without presence, and meaning without attribution. At the fourth movement of this final passage, the individual no longer frames absence as an achievement, but as a natural condition, understanding that even the concept of completion can become a subtle attachment if it is observed too closely. Attention shifts entirely away from the system itself and toward the conditions surrounding it, recognizing that no structure exists in isolation and that endurance depends as much on environment as on internal design. The individual's remaining involvement is purely atmospheric, expressed not through decisions or oversight, but through the quiet maintenance of contextual stability where needed, ensuring that external shocks do not force unnatural adaptation. Wealth now behaves like deep geological capital, slow-moving, pressure-bearing, and largely invisible, absorbing stress across long horizons without surface disruption. Capital allocation favors irreversibility-resistant domains, those whose value compounds through continuity rather than novelty, such as foundational knowledge, institutional memory, and cultural literacy. The individual fully abandons the impulse to optimize, having learned that optimization narrows future paths, while resilience multiplies them. Psychological orientation is defined by radical acceptance, where uncertainty is not merely tolerated but respected as the engine of evolution. The individual no longer distinguishes between personal time and historical time, perceiving both as overlapping currents rather than separate scales. Relationships persist without maintenance, validated by endurance rather than interaction, and capable of surviving absence without reinterpretation. Influence has become diffuse, indistinguishable from tradition, embedded so deeply that its origin cannot be traced or contested. The individual recognizes that at this depth correction is more dangerous than patience, and intervention more destabilizing than restraint. What remains is a posture of non-interference grounded in confidence, not neglect, a trust earned through decades of alignment between principle and practice. This stage confirms that the system no longer needs belief, memory, or supervision to persist, and that the journey from nothing has culminated not in permanence of form, but in permanence of function, where continuity exists without effort, and strength is expressed through silence rather than control. At the fifth movement, even silence becomes intentional, and the individual recognizes that the most fragile point of any enduring system is the moment when its creator attempts to validate its independence by observing it. Attention fully withdraws, not out of indifference, but out of respect for autonomy, acknowledging that observation itself can distort behavior over long horizons. The individual releases all remaining narratives about origin, struggle, or vision, understanding that stories eventually become constraints if they harden into doctrine. Wealth is now fully abstracted, no longer tracked as assets or performance, but as capacity embedded within institutions, relationships, and shared norms that regenerate value without attribution. Capital flows are slow, predictable, and principle-bound, designed to outlast cycles of ideology, technology, and leadership turnover without requiring reinterpretation. Psychological discipline reaches a state where even pride in restraint dissolves, replaced by neutrality toward outcomes that unfold beyond any single lifespan. The individual no longer distinguishes between success and failure at the system level, knowing that both are surface expressions of deeper adaptive processes. Human connections persist as distributed trust rather than personal allegiance, allowing cooperation to continue without reliance on memory of the founder. Mentorship echoes forward indirectly, transmitted through decision patterns, incentive structures, and cultural defaults rather than instruction. The individual accepts that entropy will eventually touch every form, but remains confident that coherence can survive entropy if encoded correctly. What remains is a profound alignment with time itself, where patience is no longer practiced but embodied, and where the ultimate proof of mastery is the absence of corrective desire. This phase confirms that the work is complete not because it is perfect, but because it no longer invites improvement from its originator, having crossed the threshold where evolution belongs entirely to what was created, not to the one who once created it. At the sixth movement, even authorship dissolves, and the individual completes the final separation between cause and continuation, accepting that true permanence requires anonymity at the source. There is no longer any impulse to audit outcomes, correct deviations, or ensure alignment, because alignment has been encoded so deeply that intervention would only weaken it. The individual understands that every visible hand eventually becomes a dependency, and every remembered name eventually becomes a distortion, so disappearance is not an ending but a structural necessity. Wealth, at this point, has fully transformed into quiet capacity embedded in rules, incentives, and cultural reflexes that allocate resources intelligently without conscious direction. Capital behaves like climate rather than weather, shaping what can grow without signaling who caused it. Influence exists only as constraint and permission, limiting destructive paths while enabling constructive ones, never instructing, never persuading. Psychological mastery reaches its terminal state, complete peace with being unnecessary, complete comfort with irrelevance, complete trust in time to sort signal from noise without supervision. Relationships persist as standards rather than bonds, as shared judgment rather than shared history, capable of surviving turnover, misunderstanding, and absence without decay. Mentorship has vanished as an activity and survived as an imprint, visible only in how future leaders hesitate before reckless action and choose restraint without knowing why. Success is measured entirely through subtraction, no crises that escalate, no cultures that rot, no systems that collapse inward seeking guidance. What began as effort, ambition, and identity has resolved into coherence without ownership, meaning without narrative, and value without attribution. This is the final proof that starting from zero was never about ascent, accumulation, or recognition, but about reaching a point where what was built no longer reflects a person at all, only a logic strong enough to endure, adapt, and continue long after its origin has vanished.